I'm interviewing Owen Smith. Now, Owen Smith is standing to be leader of the Labour Party. Appropriately enough, I'm actually standing just outside where the Labour Party was founded. We're going to go and talk at a pub just around the corner. This is a female time for the Labour Party, to say the very least. It's allkickingoff.com. Now, there was a coup launched against Jeremy Corbyn that's blown open a leadership contest. Jeremy Corbyn's opponents have they're all very much behind Owen Smith. So I suppose the question is, what are his policies? How is he different from Jeremy Corbyn? Is he a right-wing shift? Is he genuinely on the left? What does he stand for, and where does he think Labour's going? And will he ever become PM? Big question mark there. So a lot to talk about. So Owen me, Owen you, a new series in which I introduce people with the same name as me. I'm joking, of course. Owen Smith.
Yep.
You're standing to be leader of the Labour Party. That's a biggie. That's a big moment.
Yep.
How are you feeling about it so far?
I'm enjoying myself. You learn lots about yourself doing something like this, and I'm finding that I'm massively enjoying talking to people, explaining to them why I'm doing it, why I believe in the Labour Party, what I want the Labour Party to be. It's been a great experience.
It's a good job Labour's not a febrile, kind of intense,
passionate.
passionate.
Who'd want that?
I mean, that'd be awful otherwise, wouldn't it? Can you imagine how intense it would be? Now, Labour, under you, if you're leader, and I'm going to be brutal about this, you can only, I was going to say 2 or 3 sentences, but Jamie extended it to 4, so you've got 4 sentences. If you're leader of the Labour Party, what is Labour's vision? In a way, on the doorstep, people can understand.
I want us to be a Labour government, first and foremost, that is seen as the natural answer to the really big questions people have got in Britain about why we're so unequal, why jobs are so insecure, why wages have been so depressed. People should look at us, whoever they are, wherever they come from, and say, Labour are the people who understand that, and that's why I'm going to vote for them. That's how we get to put our principles into practice, by winning and then exercising our principles, our values in power.
I think you've done that thing with sentences. You've had lots of commas, so I can't tell technically what a sentence is that.
I think it was about 4.
We'll let it slide, not
about
brutal.
4.
I'm not going to press an ejector button. Now, there are lots of people out there who really like Jeremy's policies, but they have questions maybe over the way he communicates, how competent he is, whether they think, I don't know, he could be elected to introduce those policies. But to be brutal, they look at you and think, not the answer. So how are you going to tell them? Because they do not think that, if I'm going to really shift my vote on this one, this is a plausible alternative.
Well, I've only had a fortnight to make that case, in fairness. I mean, people are attacking people for saying that Jeremy had, a year to make his case, and that wasn't long enough. I've only had a fortnight, and I'm intending to continue making that case. Look, I understand why people like Jeremy's policies. I like most of Jeremy's policies. I understand why people feel enthused by Jeremy. I just didn't serve in the shadow cabinet because I was loyal to the Labour Party. I was optimistic about what Jeremy could achieve. I thought he was right to say some of the things he was saying about how New Labour was too timid, how we had much bigger problems in society than we'd provided answers to. He was right about party democracy being something that had been ridden roughshod over. But the trouble is, he's not put any more flesh on the bones. He had 9 months in order to try and take that forward and turn it into a programme that people in the country, not just in the Labour movement, in the country, could turn around and say, we can believe in this as something to put our trust in. This is winning credibility and respect back for Labour, which we've lost over a long period. And unfortunately, he's not done that. And so what I'm saying is it's time for him to hand on, I think, to a new generation of Labour men and women who are just as radical as he is, who are just as committed to tackling inequality and just as committed to Labour being an anti-austerity party, but maybe have got a few more concrete ideas about how we would do it and maybe can appeal more broadly in the country. Because we've got to forge a coalition. We've got to get people who voted Tory and Liberal and Green to vote Labour. Otherwise, we can't win power. And if we don't win power, then what's it all for?
So succinctly, why are you more electable, do you think?
Well, partly because I think I can forge a better coalition in Westminster. Biggest job of the leader of the Labour Party is to turn the coalition that is Labour, has always been a coalition from 100 years ago when we were created, and turn that into an effective fighting force in Westminster, opposing the Tories powerfully on tax credits as I did, or on PIP cuts as I did. And we've not done that. He's not been able to forge that. That's why he ended up with so many members of the Parliamentary Labour Party voting no confidence in him. It's a massive failure on his part to hold us all together. And secondly, he's not succeeded in putting together a really solid programme. You know, I've started talking about a British New Deal, saying we should be borrowing 200 billion quid in order to invest in this country. John McDonnell's had 12 months to come up with that policy. He came up with it a week after I did. You know, why haven't we been putting more flesh on the bones? We've been strong on slogans like anti-austerity, but really weak at explaining what we are in favour of, what are we pro, and I'm pro-prosperity for everyone.
Now, politics is a brutal affair, and this is a particularly brutal contest in lots of ways, and passions are very high on all sides. But the brutal kind of, the way in terms of your being kind of, or the concerns people have, or whatever you describe it, is that this guy's a political opportunist. He was a Blairite under Blair, a Brownite under Brown. Now he's the competent version of Jeremy Corbyn. And what you've done is you've gone, well, the Labour Party membership, they've shifted to the left. So I will pitch to the left. But as soon as you become leader, you're going to go straight to the right. So how would you argue against that? You just shifted with the wind. Why are you a genuine left-winger in a way that lots of people in the Labour Party want?
By telling you the truth, which is it's not true that I've shifted with the wind. It just isn't true, full stop. And my background in the party is long. You know, we're here near where the Labour Party was forged. Well, you know, my great-grandfather was a Tonopandi rioter fighting for better wages and, for a living wage. 106 years ago, you know, against Churchill and the Liberals and the Tories at the time. And I'm someone who's been dyed in the wool in the Labour movement for all that period. But I've obviously been someone who's been a politician and somebody who's been advising politicians during periods when Labour's been in office. And I've said a few things, and those things have been quite often taken out of context and spun into, you know, things that they're not. So people have said I'm in favour of privatising the NHS. What a load of rubbish. People have said, oh, I'm definitely in favour of PFI and therefore I'm a Blairite. What a load of rubbish.
Can we come on to that? In what sense? Because the comments seem to suggest that. So why aren't they true?
Well, because they're just not true, is the bottom line. I was someone who was a critic of New Labour. I was someone who was an advisor to the last Labour government in Northern Ireland on the peace process. And I think we did great work in Northern Ireland bringing peace. But I think we made loads of big mistakes. And one of the big mistakes was we didn't appreciate, I think, how important it is to cleave to eternal, universal Labour values. We did redistribute resource, pensioners, children taken out of poverty, etc. But we also deployed language, like saying we were really comfortable with people getting incredibly rich, or we were comfortable with, you know, private sector involvement in the NHS. And the important thing for us to have learned subsequently, and I feel I've learned these lessons, is that language matters massively. I'm seeing that in this contest, aren't I? Where, you know, injudicious use of words by me either in the contest or in the past is coming back to bite me. But the reality is, Labour, in using some of that language, in failing to be really clear about what we stood for, both fueled cynicism in politics, because people felt that Labour had moved its position massively, and people felt that meant politics itself was shifting, and we allowed the Tories to use our language as a Trojan horse, to subvert our language. So the classic example is the way in which they've marketised, privatised the NHS, whilst saying they were simply carrying on what we were doing. Another classic example is the use of academies in schools. They're trying to break up the notion of any local democratic control over our schools and using Labour's much more limited academies programme as the excuse for that. Now, I've learned those lessons the hard way, having been part of this for the last 20 years, and I think I'm now incredibly clear that what I've always believed in is what I believe in, and we've got to be really careful to safeguard it.
So on the NHS, because those are the comments, for example, you discussed, and the fear is there, because lots of people in the Labour Party now, most people think that under not just the Conservatives, but there's creeping privatisation under New Labour, and also on PFI, many think it's just like paying for service on a credit card. So what are your views on the NHS in terms of taking into account what happened in New Labour? And I mean, what would the NHS look like under an Owen Smith government? This is a categorical reassurance of Labour Party members.
Well, look, people are right to have those concerns, is the truth, because PFI, Labour inherited an NHS that was, £39 billion a year being spent on it. By the time we left, it had £112 billion spent a year on it, and we massively improved The hospital stock, the physical infrastructure and all the rest. It desperately needed doing. We're going to have to do it again, by the way, given the way the Tories are running it down. But we were wrong to use PFI to do that. At the time, I think lots of people, myself included, thought, well, look, any way in which we can get these new hospitals built, because they're necessary, is a good way. But the truth is, we now know that it was a useless way to do it that left people and local health boards saddled with debt. The second Severn Bridge across the Channel, we're still paying for that. It's costing billions of pounds for us. So it was the wrong thing to do. The reason I'm now saying we should be borrowing is government should be paying for that. On the books, new hospitals, new infrastructure. And the reason I say the NHS should be 100% publicly funded, free at the point of use, is that any shift away from that allows the Tories to subvert, allows them to say, here's our excuse to do what they always want to do, which is break up the NHS.
So their privatisation will be repealed?
Totally. I mean, I fought against it line by line in the health bill back in 2011 when I was working with John Healey on that. I will fight against it every day because the NHS, the reason they hate it is it's the best expression of what we're about. Pooling risk, sharing reward, universal services, everybody relies upon them, everybody pays in. It's an institution that reflects the core of Labour's values, inequality and sharing. And that's why they will always try and break it up. They're doing exactly what they've always done in the past, which is say, oh, we can't afford the NHS, it's unsustainable. It's not a coincidence that just about every trust in the land is in debt. They want them in debt, because that way they can turn around and say it's not affordable as a publicly funded service.
New Labour, now we can all talk about the achievements. You worked on the Northern Ireland Peace process, as you've said, minimum wage, LGBT rights, devolution and so on. What, kind of succinctly, is your critique? Where did New Labour go wrong?
I think they went wrong mainly in failing to understand that unless you give people a really clear sense of where the Labour Party sits and what our red lines are, and those red lines in terms of public ownership, those red lines in terms of fairness, equality, those red lines in terms of proper representation for people in the workplace, then eventually you erode faith in politics and you undermine faith in the Labour Party and you fuel cynicism. So without a doubt, we simply on lots of issues went with the flow. We believed the market would redistribute resources efficiently and that the state in lots of ways should get out of the way. Completely wrong. Market liberalisation of the city and elsewhere, the financialisation of so much of our industry has left people immeasurably worse off, more insecure, lesser jobs close to where they live, lesser sense of their value and worth in the world. All of those things came about because we weren't strong enough in understanding what really matters. And unfortunately, the next Labour government is going to have to rebuild lots of that. We're going to have to reinstate a sense of value in local communities. We're going to have to reindustrialise parts of Britain. And there is a job of work to be done, I think, that is enormous. But there's practical things to do. Borrow the money. British New Deal, £200 billion to be spent across parts of Britain that have been left behind. Reinstate workers' rights. Build up our trade unions. All of these things can be done.
So in terms of to avoid any sort of the attack, you're getting lots of attacks, but it's just a pound shop Ed Miliband with a Welsh accent. Where do you think at the last election that it failed in terms of what Ed Miliband and Ned Balls were offering? Because lots of people in the Labour Party now, they look at that. Most people in the country don't use terms like austerity light, but lots of people felt that basically there was no coherent, genuine alternative to the government's economic strategy. So what's your critique of that? Because you were part of the shadow.
Yeah, and it wasn't coherent. And truthfully, I think what it was is that there were a lot of people who'd been part of that last Labour government and who weren't yet prepared to admit what we'd got wrong. And therefore, they weren't prepared to offer a really honest critique of the scale of the problems we've got in Britain. Gross insecurity, massive inequalities, the rich getting richer, poor people in this country ever worse off. We couldn't admit, many of those people having been part so recently of a Labour government, just how big the problems were. And that hamstrung us when it came to both telling a story about Britain and offering a coherent vision for what we've got to get right. They were scared, is the truth. Scared to offer that. Also, I think scared that they were a generation who felt that those answers, that our left-wing answers, that our socialist answers that are required couldn't win us elections. And therefore they hedged and they fudged, and we ended up with a ragbag of policies that loads of people, members, voters, just thought, you know, there's not enough there. There's not enough of a critique. There's not enough of a set of answers. I'm really clear. I know what's wrong with Britain, and I know what we're going to do to fix it. And I'm not going to be timid about it. I'm going to be bold and radical about it.
One of the reasons Labour members are very angry is they feel that, not that long ago, a few months ago, about 60% of them voted for Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party. In terms of, as an open democratic contest, you could say people like John Smith got a higher percentage, but as an open democratic contest, this was the greatest mandate of a Labour Party leader. And just a few months down the road, there's this undemocratic coup staged by the Parliamentary Labour Party against the members' own interests. And many of those people think you're part of this pre-planned coup against the democratic wishes of the party membership. So, in what sense are you not?
Well, in every sense, I'm not. I didn't know about the coup. You know, I wasn't rung by Hilary Benn or anybody in advance of it. In fact, on the Sunday when colleagues who were in the Shadow Cabinet were resigning, I got together with Lisa Nandy and Neil Griffiths and John Healy and Kate Green, who's, you know, some of the people who are helping run my campaign now. And we decided we'd go and see Jeremy on the following day, not to resign, but to say to him, how on earth are we going to get out of this mess, Jeremy? What's your plan for trying to reunite the party? It was on that night, of course, that there was meant to be this vote of no confidence. And the reason I ended up resigning, we all ended up resigning that morning, is in that meeting, Jeremy couldn't answer that question. I put it to him 3 times. You know, what are you going to do? Because we are teetering on the edge of a precipice here. The party could be split. You know, the party that's been here for 116 years, the greatest source for social and economic justice, could be bust apart and disappear. He couldn't answer. John McDonnell, who bust into the meeting, simply shrugged his shoulders when I said to him that I thought he was prepared to split the party. And he said, if that's what it takes. And I've repeated that many times because it is precisely what he said, no matter what he says now. And I think what he meant by that was he was prepared to see the Labour Party broken for his project. And I don't think his project is necessarily about Labour being returned to power and putting into practice our principles. But that's what I'm about. I'm about Parliament being the point of the spear for Labour, the point where we, you know, use our franchise, use our abilities to win the arguments and then put them into practice through governing in Britain. That's what the Labour Party's for. Without that, it's just howling into the wind.
But in terms of talk of split, I mean, in the Daily Telegraph, there was reports, presumably from some Labour MPs on the right of the party, saying that if Jeremy wins again, then there will be a split and they will, whatever, form their own autonomous parliamentary faction. Do you unequivocally condemn that?
I want nothing to do with that. I completely condemn it. And the truth is, there are people on the hard left and on the right of the Labour Party who become fatalistic about a split and are concerned either with, you know, controlling the terms of it or not being blamed for it. As far as I'm concerned, it is the Labour Party or nothing. There is not another vehicle coming down the road if this one falls to pieces. We've got to save the Labour Party, and that means uniting the Labour Party, and I'll have no truck with that. Look, if I lose this, I will be in the Labour Party till the day I die, and I will serve the Labour Party till the day I die. But I don't think Jeremy winning this is the best way for us to heal the rifts in the Labour Party, and I certainly don't think it's the best way for us to fulfil our mission, which is to win power on behalf of the people. That's what we're about. We're about winning power in order to put into practice our principles, not simply expounding our principles. We're going to win in order to put them into practice.
One of the fears people have on the left of the party is that if you win, whatever, you know, what you stand for now, that you will purge the left. Momentum, anyone who's a member of that will be purged, anyone on the left will be purged. How would you pledge? Would you pledge now there will not be some mass purge of people on the left of the party?
Yeah, look, nothing could be further from my mind. I've said throughout this that I'm determined, whatever mud is thrown at me, I'm determined that we should use this process as a means of healing the Labour Party and seeking to unite us. It's looking that that's incredibly difficult to do at the moment because people are getting dug into camps. But we've got to try and avoid that because win, lose or draw, the party has to come back together. And we should be pleased that Jeremy has got so many people activated into politics. The fact that he's getting these massive rallies and people are interested in it, great. You know, I've got nothing but pleasure to see that. It's brilliant that the Labour Party is a mass movement right now. But we've got to direct it, haven't we? You know, all that brilliant energy we've created, it's got to be directed into something. And I think it has got to be directed into winning power in order to put those principles that so many people clearly hold so dearly, and I share with them, into practice.
But people think that enthusiasm, that huge grassroots enthusiasm, will just dissipate if you become leader. I mean, Jeremy's got these big crowds in Liverpool, they're all, you know, so optimistic and full of hope. What you know, in terms of that grassroots enthusiasm, won't Thursday die? Loads of people leave the party. And how could you harness that enthusiasm? How could you keep it going? What would you do with it?
Well, on this I'm a Bennite, see, because I think it's about the issues, not the people. And I think the reason those people are so enthused is not just Jeremy Corbyn, it's what Jeremy's been saying. You know, that's the reason. You know, Jeremy Corbyn, somebody said to me at a rally the other day, we think of him as the Messiah. Well, he's not the Messiah.
He's a very naughty one.
Well, I use that joke as well. But, you know, he's just another Labour man. You know, same as me. We are none of us bigger than the party. We are all servants of the party. Jeremy Corbyn, me, you know, you, we're all just part of this movement. And the important stuff are the ideas, the values, the principles. Putting that stuff into practice, that's what really counts. And I think we've got to, you know, Jeremy could have been doing a lot more, I think, with the volume of people that he's activated to say, right, how do we turn this social movement into a political movement that drives us forward to win? How do we get those people knocking on doors, evangelising for Labour, speaking to their neighbours? Because it feels a bit sometimes as though we're speaking to ourselves and more concerned with internal rows and internal disputes and settling old scores internally than we are with where we should be looking, which is to the future and to the people.
A lot of people, and you've had this ad infinitum, but it's a point which comes up time and time again. They go, how can this guy be a candidate of the left? He was the head of public affairs for Pfizer, this big corporate titan. And, you know, so how can someone be this socialist, firebrand, anti-austerity politician and have worked for this corporate titan? How would you explain that to people?
Because we live in a modern, complicated world in which there are big companies, and you know, I'm not ashamed of having done that. You know, I think it's valuable to have seen the inside of those big corporations because you know how they operate and you know what we've got to do in order to tame them and make sure that they are working in the interests of the people. You do know, for example, what they can afford to bear in terms of the sorts of taxes that we should be levying on them. You do know what they do to try and, you know, hide the profits they earn. I've seen all of that stuff, and I think it's incredibly valuable. And in truth, it's one of the reasons I'm sort of, you know, evangelical about what I now do, because I suppose that for me there were like two moments in my life when I really came alive politically. One was, I've talked about a lot, which is the miners' strike when I was a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, and I saw just how pernicious that Tory government was at trying to smash the communities I grew up in. We had, you know, friends and family who were working in the industry. But probably more radicalising for me was actually working for big companies in the southeast of England and seeing the massive difference between the attitudes of people who are pretty well off and, you know, living in leafier parts of Britain, and the opportunities that they enjoy and the opportunities the people I grew up with and live amongst now, my people I went to school with. And it's a massive gulf. And for me, the job of the Labour Party is, in most basic terms, about narrowing that gulf. That's why I said the other day we should be talking much more about equality of outcome and not being frightened of saying that. You know, you can't guarantee that everybody has the same outcome. Of course you can't. But you can try and get closer to everybody having a chance to live a really decent life, everybody having, you know, not just opportunities, but actually having a decent life, sufficient income. And that means government intervening. It means strong, muscular, robust government on the behalf of the people.
So briefly, I mean, how would you challenge corporate Britain then? Just to prove, you know, you're not this stooge of
I'd stick taxes up for a start. I mean, what on earth are we doing trying to get to a corporation tax of 17%? It's like half of the corporation tax of most of the rest of the world.
United States.
You know, it's just, you know, it is immoral and it's not working. It's not resulting in foreign direct investment flooding into this country. Do you remember Osborne before the last But one election he said that this was the secret. Well, it's obviously not, because it's not working. So I'd crank back up corporation tax to 20%. I'd be much bolder in terms of high pay in this country. We need a high pay commission that should be looking at, for example, companies that are that are providing services to the government. Why should Atos or G4S or Capita be able to pay their bosses £2 million and 260 time average earnings when they're earning their money from the taxpayer? That's the sort of radical policy we should be putting in place to constrain excessive profits and excessive greed in our corporations. And that's not anti-business. It's about saying it's a bit of fair play. Corporations benefit in this country from having a healthy workforce because of our NHS. Well, let's ask them to pay a bit more through their taxes towards the NHS. I'd ring fence those corporation tax receipts to put 4% into the NHS every year.
Communication. So, it used to be of work in public affairs and so on. And one of the big criticisms against Jeremy Corbyn is his communication and how he communicates to the country as a whole. But as you've said, you've had what some would say were gaffes. So smashing Theresa May back on her heel. Some people thought was quite sexist. So, do you regret that? And how would you say to people that you will be a better communicator, someone who can deal with the media better to get across a message in an environment where the media are always hostile to Labour leaders, that you will be able to communicate with people better and avoid gaffes like that, for example?
Well, it was a mistake to use that language, and I've apologised for it. But I did it because I am passionate about what the Tories have been doing to Britain. I'm massively passionate about the way in which austerity has wreaked havoc in lots of our communities. Loads of services people rely upon have been closed down. 86% of those cuts have rained down on women, in particular in sort of ex-industrial areas of Britain. So I am genuinely deep down seething with anger about that. And I am angry that we haven't been strong enough as an opposition. We want some really good stuff, tax credits, PIP, but they've been few and far between. And over the last 6 years, they have privatised the NHS effectively. They've broken up our school system. They've introduced massive cuts on disabled people in Britain. There are umpteen things they've done. We haven't been able to push back. So I am angry about it. And I was too angry and too over the top in describing that. I think it was probably a tennis or a rugby analogy I was trying to grope for, but it was clumsy, and I'll need to be more. I'm not the finished article, I'm just not. I am someone who's coming into this speaking from the heart about what I feel about what's wrong with Britain and how I think we should try and fix it. And that will probably mean that I'll make a few mistakes, but I think I can tell people honestly what I feel, and I think they will see that I'm being honest about how deeply I feel these issues must be tackled. And it's vital that we have a credible Labour government in waiting. We've lost massive trust, Owen. The Labour Party isn't looked at in Yorkham's place or mine, anywhere in Britain, as the natural party of government at the moment. And we've got to be that. Otherwise, Theresa May or somebody else will continue to rule this country for a long time ahead, and we should all be really, really angry about that.
What are your policies on social security? And one of the reasons this is important is because one of the things that I think that really galvanised support for Jeremy Corbyn was the welfare reform bill last year, and you, amongst most colleagues in the PLP, abstained. So do you regret that? And what are your concrete policies to deal with that? Because the demonisation of social security claimants, the policies that the government have introduced from the bedroom tax to the way disabled people are treated, makes people so angry.
Yeah.
So what?
Well, I regret abstaining on that vote more than anything else I've done in politics. And the reason I regret it more than anything else is that I knew it was wrong at the time, and I told Andy Burnham that at the time.
He was supporting for.
Well, I was actually one of 3 people, I think, who in shadow cabinet said that we should be opposing the bill outright and listed the things that we should be opposing. And we were then went into the leadership contest, and I told Andy that I thought he ought to resign, and I would have resigned alongside him. And a lot of people felt that Labour disunity and the prospect of that being seen as a massive split in the party was a greater concern, and that we should stick together. It was wrong, I was wrong, we should have stood against it. So I'm proud that when I was offered by Jeremy Corbyn the chance to be Department for Work and Pension Shadow Secretary, I reversed our position and we opposed it line by line, policy by policy, right throughout the rest of the passage of the bill. We went from abstaining on it to fully opposing it. And I'm incredibly proud that two of the things that Jeremy likes to talk about as big victories, the tax credits reversal and the PIP reversal, the personal independence payments to disabled people, those were won on my watch. You know, I helped deliver those things along with House of Lords and others, but it was the DWP team led by me that fought for those things. So I think my record on that is pretty clear. You know, Labour made one of the other big mistakes New Labour made. We used to, you know, bang on about being tough on welfare. Well, it's the wrong language for Labour to be using. You know, we won't be. We believe in social security. We believe in supporting people in work. And the biggest scandal in this country is the growth of in-work poverty. Millions of people who are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and still haven't got enough money to pay for their house, you know, clothe their kids properly, have a holiday, all basic things that we used to take for granted. And we're not getting them anymore. People have, you know, lots of those things just feel like an impossible dream, and that's wrong in Britain.
And I mean, you said you're going to break up the Department of Work and Pensions.
Yeah, it's become a byword for cruelty. You know, ATOS and the work capability assessments, all of the ways in which it's, you know, scapegoated people who are, you know, in need of support, not in need of demonisation. That awful language of skivers and scroungers and Straddle. I hate all that. Absolutely hate it. And I would scrap it tomorrow. I'd replace it with a proper Department for Social Security. Words matter. Words really matter. Social security is what it's always been for Labour, not welfare. So we should stick to that language. And we also need a Ministry of Labour in this country, a Secretary of State for Labour who's got a job to reform pay, terms and conditions, trade union rights, all the things that we need to act as a bulwark against the financialisation of capital and of industry in this country.
Workers have fewer rights in this country than many other advanced Western countries, and how are you going to address that?
Well, I launched today a workers' manifesto to do exactly that. We've gone from being, you know, a proud bastion of workers' rights in Britain to, over the last 20 years, becoming the, you know, the sick man of Europe on workers' rights. People have got fewer rights here than they enjoyed 20 years ago, and fewer rights than they enjoy in other parts of the world, and it's wrong. So we should repeal the Trade Union Act, completely unnecessary, vindictive, politically motivated. We should go back to supporting collective bargaining in many sectors of our society. We should make sure that where we've got it, pay review bodies are properly respected. We should have workers on remuneration committees very clearly. We should make sure that we've got workers' rights from day one. Before I was in this race back in 2014, I was working with others on something called the Workers' Pledge. Jeremy's stuff that I've also been involved in, the Workplace 2020, was built on that. It's about having a whole suite of policies, you know, strapping the public sector pay freeze, making sure that we've got, you know, ratios between the highest and lowest paid in our companies published. There's a whole raft of things, 25 ideas I published today. Got to get back to using these things. Wages councils, we used to have them. We had the last one was the Agricultural Wages Board. The Tories scrapped that. I helped fight to retain that and replace it in Wales with a new Welsh Agricultural Wages Board. Net result of that, agricultural farm workers in Wales got 6% pay rise over their counterparts in England. You know, there are lots of things we could do. Some of these are old ideas, some of them are new ideas, but we need them.
The Tories only had a lead amongst people over 44 at the last general election, and we have an ageing population. And the brutal truth is that if Labour do not win more support from older people, then Labour is unlikely ever to form a government in this country. So what would you do to win over older people?
Are older people now over 44? You're making
you're
making me feel really old at 46
I'm about
now.
to turn 32.
Oh yeah, I don't think that's very old.
So amongst people, to clarify, yes, over 44, but it gets steeper the older you get. So over 65, the Tories had a huge lead at the last general election, and 80% turned out.
Yeah.
Compared to younger people, 18 to 25, Labour had a huge lead, but for only 43% turnout.
Well,
so how would you win over people, pensioners, older people? How would you win them over?
Yeah, well, some of that is, I think, about the Labour Party looking once more like a credible government in waiting, because what I think a lot of older people feel is, one, that traditional Labour voters, one, that Labour stopped being a proper Labour Party, so we've got to persuade them that we're a proper Labour Party again. Second, I think they feel that we don't look credible and they really value competence and credibility. So those two things are important. Third thing, lots of older people feel, is that there's been a real sense of decline in their community over a long time. So investment, the £200 billion borrowing programme, a British New Deal to rebuild communities, hugely important that we do that. The NHS, lots of our older voters, citizens across the country, either massively value the idea of the NHS or actually rely upon it. So getting the NHS back up to the levels of investment that the last Labour government got it up to means putting 4% a year in. That means introducing the sorts of taxes I've talked about, a wealth tax on people who are earning over £150,000 and have got additional revenues, incomes from dividends and shares and property and all of that sort of stuff. They should be paying more money in order to help fund our NHS. I think that's the sort of programme that would win support, not just in traditional Labour areas, but in lots of parts of the country where people just feel things have been going into decline and it's time to arrest that and rebuild the country.
It's projected there'll be more self-employed people than public sector workers in the coming years. So what policies do you have for self-employed people?
Well, first of all, we've got to scrap, I think, some of the ways in which people have been forced into self-employment. The building trade's a classic example where you've got these umbrella companies taking people, forcing them. I mean, it's happened for years and years and years, forcing them to be self-employed. They don't really want to be self-employed. They're not really self-employed quite often. So we need to, use legislation to get rid of that. In-work support's another massive issue. Getting rid of tax credits. The two biggest groups of people hit by the cuts to tax credits and hit to the tune of about £3,000 a year or even 5,000 in some cases, women and the self-employed. So I campaigned quite a lot on how we need to reverse that for the self-employed. Trouble is, though we won on tax credits, they're still going to take the money away through universal credit, so we need to campaign much harder on that. I did my level best to get universal credit cuts up the agenda. Tougher to do that because it's quite a few years into the future, but that's going to be a massive blow to self-employed people in this country and they need our support. Getting health and safety legislation to apply to the self-employed so that they've got greater support and confidence, that's another vital way in which we can take things forward.
You mostly summed up your economic policies, but just to guarantee, you're not talking about cuts.
No,
we should be a genuine alternative to austerity.
We should be investing. Look, I am an anti-austerity politician. It was a fundamental mistake at the last election for us not to be clear enough about that. You don't cut your way to growth in business or in a country. You need to invest. And the Tory line that we can't leave debts to our children and we can't afford to do this, we've got to turn that on its head. We can't afford not to invest because otherwise we are leaving failing institutions, crumbling infrastructure, public services that aren't fit for the job, insecurity at work, higher education fees that people can't live with. That's what we're leaving to our children unless this generation of politicians gets elected and does something about it.
In the ward I grew up in, Stockport voted to leave the European Union, and almost certainly one of the main reasons for that, as it was across the country, was because of immigration. In truth, there were very few immigrants where I grew up. In London, where there's lots of immigrants, we're in the centre here, 40% living here are foreign born, hostility to immigration is much lower, and people voted to remain in large numbers in inner London. And many people in the Labour Party, they really feel angry at what they see as a scapegoating of immigrants.
Yeah.
Now, on immigration, you've talked in a way, I think, which a lot of Labour Party members go, I'm not up for this. So just explain, what is your position on immigration?
Okay, so the first thing to say, right, is I understand why people are angry, and I understand why people feel, as I feel, that Labour's always got to, not use the racist language that's been employed quite liberally over the last few years. Theresa May trailing around London with those racist ad vans, Nigel Farage trailing around the country with racist posters. Labour can't ever give any succour or truck to that stuff. But we've also got to recognise the issue you pointed to, which is in your community and mine. My community, like yours, very little immigration, but people voted to leave. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that it's parts of Britain that are, to use that horrible phrase, left behind, where people feel that the economic opportunities they face are really limited, and the sense of decline in their community and in the standard of services they enjoy has been quite precipitous. Those communities were the communities that looked for someone to blame, and immigrants were blamed in lots of those communities. In some other parts of Britain, there was definitely an impact from, in particular, Eastern European migrants and changes to terms and conditions in local jobs. We've got to be honest about that, honest about it. But we can't ever get sucked into, scapegoating ourselves. We've got to avoid that at all costs.
There's a huge housing crisis in this country. Lack of council housing, millions of people trapped on social housing waiting lists, an unregulated private rented sector. Home ownership has collapsed to its lowest level since the mid-1980s, particularly amongst younger people, for whom home ownership, particularly in big cities, not just London, we saw statistics about Manchester. How did it, succinctly, with that three-pronged element of the housing crisis?
Well, we've got to build houses for a start. It's not rocket science.
Nice, isn't it?
Well, we should be building, Bevan had it right in the 50s, we should be building 300,000 houses a year. We should be building, 1.5 million houses over a part.
How would we do it?
Borrow is the first answer. Borrow in order to build through the British New Deal, allow councils to borrow, allow councils to determine what their local social housing need and borrow. This story today about people being not able to save because rents are so high and not being able to afford to pay the rent now being a massive problem across not just London but the whole of the country, that's got to tell us we've got to do something to control rents. We should be thinking much harder about whether we need to introduce European style or some American city style caps on rents, controls on rents, and be upfront about that, because we can't just have rents spiralling ever further out of control. I've got 3 kids. I don't know how they'll afford to buy a house. I drove past the house that me and my wife bought in West Norwood when we were in our mid-20s. I'm now an MP. I couldn't afford to buy that house today. I couldn't afford to buy it probably if I became the Prime Minister. Something's gone cataclysmically wrong with our housing market, and the big answer is build in order to increase supply, in order to drive down prices, and in the meantime do something about high rents.
A lot of people in the Labour Party think the markets are run rampant in this country and they want public ownership to be back on the agenda. What are your plans for that?
So do I. I think privatising the railways has obviously been a complete disaster, both the way in which it was done and the services now people enjoy, so we should be taking the railways back into private ownership, and I think public ownership rather, and we should be thinking much harder about what other public goods should be held in public hands. Because part of the issue I think New Labour got wrong is if we don't do that, and if we don't understand what our common wealth is, what are the things we want to hold together and fund together and rely upon together, what are those public goods, then we erode a part of what Labour's about. So I think we should be thinking about ways in which next generation of energy is in public hands. Why haven't we got a national company that is responsible for renewables? Why are we relying, for example, on private companies to take forward really good ideas like harnessing tidal energy around Britain? It just doesn't make any sense to me. If it makes sense for a private company to invest money and get a return on it, why doesn't the government do it? Especially when we're talking about those returns being set over a 50, 100-year period. It makes perfect sense for us to be thinking about other ways in which we could think about the next generation of industries and public goods and running them ourselves.
Jumping around a bit, but Scotland's gone, isn't it? There's no chance of any Labour renewal in that.
I don't agree with that.
They came third at the last election.
The
poll rating is catastrophic. Behind the Tories.
But we did, and Jeremy needs to reflect on that. We've gone backwards.
It's a long-standing problem.
We've gone backwards. We're now beneath the Tories in Scotland. It is a long-standing problem. The answer to it, and the reason I don't agree with you that it can't be done, we've got to give people faith that Labour can win in the rest of Britain. Part of the reason people didn't vote for us last time is they didn't think we were going to win. Part of the reason they didn't vote for us is they didn't think we were radical enough, and they didn't think we got the scale of the problems they felt. Now, I campaigned lots up there, both the referendum and in the election, and I encountered all of the same feelings that I encountered in marginal, left behind, post-industrial parts of England and Wales. People just feel a sense of decline. They think all the opportunities are down in London and the southeast, and that they don't get listened to. So the answer has to be put in place a radical economic programme that is going to work in Scotland and work across the rest of the UK, and is going to be popular and win. Understand that identity matters massively. I am a proud patriotic Welshman as well as being British. I think we've understood that better in Wales. That's why we're in power, harnessing a sense of national identity and national purpose for the purposes of socialism. That's why Labour is still winning in Wales. We've got to do that in Scotland. That means having a concrete plan for having a more federal Britain, a more federal Labour Party, accepting that that is the way forward. You know, Jeremy's had 9 months to come up with some of these ideas, and he's not particularly interested in some of them. I've raised the issue of constitutional reform with him, on quite a few occasions. It's not something that floats his boat, but it's essential if Labour is going to win back, because we won't win Scotland back if we don't get that we're going to have to, have a greater degree of autonomy for the party in Scotland and for Scotland versus the rest of the UK. Reforming our institutions in London. Why haven't we got a role for the Scottish Party to have a greater seat at the table in the shadow cabinet or in cabinet? Why aren't we thinking about reforming the House of Lords in order to reflect the constitutional makeup of a federal Britain? We should be getting on with this stuff. Otherwise, Britain's going to break up before our eyes.
Britain has voted to leave the European Union.
Yep.
And most of the Labour Party desperately did not want that to happen.
Yeah.
So what is your plan now when it comes to Brexit, bearing in mind, some of the northern Labour seats were the ones that have voted most decisively to leave. How do you possibly straddle the divide with people in London who vote Labour want to stay in the EU? A lot of people vote.
Well, I think we just got to be true to what we believe in, which is going to be difficult because large parts of the country that votes Labour and has voted Labour in the past voted to leave. I think it was a cataclysmic decision for Britain. I respect why people made those decisions. They thought they were doing the right thing for their communities, but I sincerely believe it's the wrong decision for Britain. It's wrong for our values. We believe in internationalism and collaboration and cooperation across borders, and we don't believe in introversion and isolation, and that's what we've now voted for. I think Jeremy didn't do a great job leading us in that referendum. I don't blame him for Brexit. I don't blame Labour for Brexit. 70% of our people voted to stay in. But the truth is, he didn't believe in the EU particularly before the referendum vote, and he came out instantly afterwards and said, let's trigger Article 50 and get out of Europe as quickly as possible. Wrong policy for us. I think we should be doing two things. We should be, number one, fighting much harder to influence the negotiation, because we don't know what it's going to look like. Loads of people were lied to. They were told there was extra money for the NHS and immigration will be dealt with, all a lie. So we should find out what the truth is. And when we get to the end of that, we should have the courage then to put it again to the British people, either at a general election in which Labour is arguing for what we believe in, which is collaboration across Europe and staying in the European Union, or if there is an election, at a second referendum. If we're in power, we should be putting to the people once more. I desperately want us to stay. I think that should be Labour's ongoing position, that we want to be in Europe.
It's political poison, isn't it? In many northern places, they really desperately want to leave. And if they hear that, they'll just go and vote for UKIP, surely.
I think we are... Look, the bank is about to, on Thursday, announce a package of emergency measures because they are worried about the prospect of a further recession in this country. It was a momentous decision that we took. Now, maybe if in 18 months' time it hasn't led to a recession, we have secured better trade terms than I think we will do, and the prospects for Britain outside the European Union look rosy, then that's the point at which you, I think, would say you probably don't. If the country at that point is clearly satisfied with what we've got, then I think reversing it will be very difficult. But if, as I suspect has happened, People haven't got the answers they want. We haven't forged trade deals that will be beneficial. We haven't solved the problem of immigration. And people are looking at this and scratching their head and wondering whether it was the right idea. Then we've got to be in a position, I think, to have the courage of our convictions and put it to the British public that they can choose to rubber stamp the deal. And if they choose then to vote out, then we'll be leaving. That much is clear. But I hope we don't. And I want Labour to be much tougher in fighting for what we believe in. I don't want us to just roll over in the face of the Tories' hard Brexit. We should be fighting much harder.
The Conservatives have unified around Theresa May now, their leader. In the polls, she's doing very well, including younger, older voters across the country. How would you win over Conservative voters? Because Theresa May is, in lots of ways, a far more dangerous from a Labour perspective leader than David Cameron is. Yeah. So how would you win over Conservative voters?
Well, it is dangerous for us. It's one of the reasons I think we've got to be really serious about the decision between Jeremy and myself in this coming election, because we are 14, 15, 16 points behind. If there is an election called next month, we will not win it. We will fight hard, but we wouldn't win it right now. I think that's impossible to imagine. So that's got to sharpen our minds when it comes to this decision. Look, Theresa May's talking a great game, isn't she? She's talking about social injustices and economic injustices. This is a woman who's been part of the cabinet that's implemented the harshest austerity regime we've ever seen in Britain. This is a woman who's been part of the cabinet that's seen the biggest fall in wages for a century, the lowest volume of house building since the 1920s, more cuts to social services than we ever thought could be achieved. This is not a nice, friendly, cuddly Tory. This is a hard right Tory who's put people into the shadow cabinet who think British workers are the biggest idlers in Britain. Chris Grayling's in there, David Davis is in there. The bloke Liam Fox who's gone off to America in order to open trade missions in North Carolina when the rest of the world is boycotting North Carolina. They are not an attractive bunch of politicians.
Not even mention Boris Johnson.
Well, Boris Johnson. I mean, what an embarrassment for Britain it is that we've got that buffoon in charge of our foreign policy. I mean, goodness only knows what he's saying when he's off overseas for us. Look, they will not succeed in persuading the British people that they are on their side. But crucially, at the moment, we're not persuading the British people that we are credible, that we deserve their respect and their trust. And it is up for us not to worry about their game, but to worry about our game. What's the game we want to play? What's the message we want to put to the British people? How do we win back the trust that we've clearly lost? And I think that is about having people and policies that people can look at and say, yeah, I can imagine these lot running the country and doing a better job. And I can see that they care about the country and they get the problems in my community, in my town, because they come from places like it and they understand the problems people have got. And they've got the ideas that we can see would mean something. Saying we'll increase the living wage, make it a proper living wage. Saying we'll introduce wage councils to guard against erosion of wages. Saying we'll tax the wealthiest in order to reduce inequality. Saying we're going to invest in the NHS because people love it and care about it. It's not rocket science. It's good old-fashioned Labour politics and Labour policies. And at the moment, we're not laying those out. At the moment, we're not winning back trust. And if we don't, Theresa May, no matter what she says, will continue to win. And our people, our communities, will continue to languish.
Finally, I always give the interviewee a chance to end on an optimistic flourish on their terms. So, lots of people just say, sacrificial lamb, you're going to get absolutely destroyed in this contest by Jeremy Corbyn in terms of the final ballot, and you're never going to become Prime Minister. So, tell me now, this is your big chance, people watching, a lot of people are going to be voting.
No pressure.
No pressure. Tell me now how you think you will become leader of the Labour Party and then become Prime Minister of this country.
Because we've never been so relevant, is the short answer. Because the Labour Party's policies have never felt so relevant. And because I'm positive that I can persuade people in the Labour Party, starting with the Labour Party, that we've got to win power in order to put those policies into practice. People in Labour care about principles very deeply, and they want those principles to be preserved and safeguarded. But they know in their bones that without power to put those principles into practice, it's all a waste of time. And I'm convinced that I can persuade them that I can be just as radical as Jeremy, just as credible as the Tories are when it comes to economic competence, and I can win back trust in this country, broader trust, build a coalition, and people who voted Tory, who voted Liberal, who voted Green, look at the Labour Party and say, that's a serious political party that's got deep convictions, deep passions about what it wants to achieve, understands how unequal and intolerant and angry and divided we've become as a country, but is optimistic about fixing it, who looks at it and says, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to be mean-spirited to one another, constantly cutting back on our services. We can invest. We can invest in each other and invest in each other's communities. And if we do that, we will reinflate a sense of hope and ambition in Britain. We can rebuild a sense of national purpose and national mission that we've lost. People have become really pessimistic in this country. And if we're not the optimists, if we're not the party that says, come on, we believe in the good side of people, we're optimistic about people, that's in our DNA, then we won't win. But I think we can, and I'm convinced that I'm the right person to do that. I'm convinced I'm the right person in my generation to carry the flag forward for Labour, and I feel that our time is right. My time is right to lead the Labour Party and to become a Labour Prime Minister.
Cheers, Owen. Nice one.
Thanks a lot.
So that's my interview with Owen Smith. Now, I'm sure, these are calm times for Labour Party, so I'm sure there'll be a nuanced discussion about that, but I genuinely want to hear, what do you think? What do you think about what he stands for? Do you believe him? Do you think he's authentic? Do you think he's a credible alternative? Or are you just thinking, no, Jeremy Corbyn all the way, not interested in that? We've got loads of interviews, including, of course, what's actually going on inside the Labour Party, including Jeremy Corbyn himself. We've got many more interviews to come, that's for sure. But as ever, please leave your comments. Want to hear what you think. Subscribe. I'll see you next time.